Well, this is sort of constructive destruction, right? Sort of the notion that, Mao Zedong had an expression, 不破不立. If you don't destroy, you can't rebuild.
Right.
So what you're suggesting is the destruction of the old order, which is always catastrophic in one way and tremendously disruptive, but also can create an enormous number of new opportunities and be very creative, because all kinds of new things have to arise. And I think we may be perched a little bit on the edge of such a thing. The danger, of course, is that we could end up in a world war. And we're sort of halfway there with Putin in the Ukraine and all of the liberal democratic countries around the world sending Leopard tanks, Abrams 1 tanks, all kinds of HIMARS, long-range artillery, and now even Poland sending fighter bombers. And the Czechs want to send fighter bombers. And so we're creeping up in Europe to a full-scale war. And if Xi, who shows very little inclination to moderate himself and temper himself, were to do something in the South China Sea, there should be an altercation between an American military vessel or a British or French, even they are out there in the Straits now joining, things could come a cropper very, very easily. So that's really dangerous. And that of course, we've been through 2 world wars. We know what happens. The companies, doesn't matter who you are, you're dead in the water on the other side of the divide. So this is why I think it's almost inevitable that we hope we don't have war, and I hope we can find an off-ramp, but it's not easy. And China does not show tremendous inclination to search in a reciprocal way, nor I might say does Russia. And here, I think we do have to understand that Xi Jinping and Putin do share something that's deeper than any national interest. And that is a deep, deep sense of grievance against the West. It's almost a psychological syndrome of humiliation, victimization. I mean, one could go on. They feel they're disrespected, marginalized, impugned. And this is very, very deep. And it makes it very, very hard for them to compromise.
But would it be just the leaders, or do you think that's like just a general sentiment that was in China, for example, there even before Xi Jinping? I remember in 2012, I could hear the same kind of, voices.
This is a deep sentiment that has come down from the last dynastic period when great powers did semi-colonialize China, and China had a very bitter experience, couldn't defend itself. And this was the toxic brew that Lenin wrote up in his On Imperialism, which China drank completely. They swallowed the Leninist views on theories on imperialism, of China being exploited and colonialized, imperialized, occupied, and one could go on. So it's really, really deep. And again, it's that sense of them not being esteemed. But the problem here is that it isn't simply that the West is doing something wrong and is arrogant and is throwing its weight around and being kind of disrespectful of Russia and China. It's that China and Russia are not acting respectably. And therefore, it's extremely difficult for most countries in the, quote, liberal democratic world to respect them. Now, other countries in Africa and the Belt and Road around the world, they don't care what China is all about, as long as they get that football stadium or the highway or the train. And so China just still does have some chops there. But it's still, the world is dividing like oil and water in a way that's very alarming. And diplomacy does not seem to have the kind of the power at this point, or the will on each side, to get together and say, wait a minute, this is dangerous.
So do you think like it can, like this competition cannot be managed? Like there were like for example, in the Cold War, right? We had a lot of management of a competition from Seoul to whatever. So do you see that there's some sort of barrier that this time there cannot be any management of this competition? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you raised the Cold War, because actually, as we look back upon it, even though I lived through it and I remember it was very stark, we did actually manage it reasonably well. We had Helsinki Accords, we had START treaties, we got rid of smallpox. You know, Khrushchev even came to the United States. When was it? 1953?
Right.
Went across the country. I think it was then he banged his shoe on the table at the UN and said, we'll bury you. But never mind, we did have interaction, and we had systems set up for instance, exchange of journalists, which is sort of collapsed in China. There is something about Xi Jinping's version of us and them, of China as being maligned, and that makes it even more difficult than it was to deal with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. There's something so deep in his soul, I think, about this idea of great power predation. And he has wedded himself so deeply to China's system, just as many leaders in Russia did to the Soviet system, Marxism, Leninism. But do remember that Russia had Khrushchev.
Right.
And Khrushchev was like Hu Yaobang or Zhao Ziyang or Deng Xiaoping, not Xi Jinping. He's like, I hate to say it, he's a bit like Stalin. And that's a difficult one to choke down. And particularly if you view it as in certain measure a kind of a psychological problem, how do you respect Stalin? You know, it's all good on the gulags, you know, Yosef, no problem. Let's just get the oil pipes pumping and let's just trade, and, you know, let's not worry our little heads about the rest of it.
I guess like strength, right? It's probably like building internal strength, because that is respected. So it's like hard power. Yes,
exactly. And, you know, there's an expression in Chinese that came down, well, it really sort of gathered momentum in the late Qing dynasty. It's Fuchang, wealth and power. What China was after, whether it was the Qing dynasty, Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Xi Jinping, it was rejuvenation. Another word that's huge in Chinese is Fuxing, rejuvenation. And it means China is not just seeking to be accepted and become soluble in the outside world. It means it wants to be the wealthiest and the most powerful, and to be able to throw its weight around. So that's a pretty toxic aspiration if you're trying to fit into an existing rules-based order, as the US hoped China would in its vision of engagement.